Refugees dying at the American border have become a regular part of our news feed these days, but they're also a part of Boston's history. That history was recently put in the spotlight by the recent dedication of a memorial on Deer Island, the last stop for hundreds of people who fled the Irish famine in the middle of the 1800s. At a ceremony on May 25th, that history was outlined by our guest, the City Archivist John McColgan. Thank you very much for being with us, John.
Thank you very much, Chris.
First of all, explain Deer Island. Why did so many people end up at Deer Island?
People ended up at Deer Island because of what was happening in South Boston at the House of Industry there. In April and May of 1847, so many people were coming in aboard the immigrant ships in such a state of destitute poverty. They were penniless. They were traumatized by the voyage over, and a great many of them were ill. They were sick mainly with the ship fever, what they call the ship fever, which was actually typhus. And so many of them were brought into the House of Industry, which was sort of a homeless shelter, and part homeless shelter, part hospital, that they overwhelmed the facilities there. And the disease was spreading among the regular inmates and among the staff and attendants and the medical people there. And it created a great public health emergency. So it was the city council that took the job into their own hands. They decided that there needed to be a separate hospital, and they decided that out on the islands would be the best place for this facility. And so they formed, it was such an emergency that they formed a special committee. It was, at that time, there was a dual legislature in the city council. There was a board of aldermen, the mayor and the board of aldermen, sort of an executive committee, and the common council, the legislative branch, if you will. And they formed a joint committee between the aldermen and the common council, the joint committee on alien passengers, to decide what to do about it. And they took into their own hands the responsibility for processing alien immigrants. And in the middle of May, this committee hopped aboard a little steamer, and they went out into the harbor, and they viewed a couple of the islands. They viewed Rainsford Island, and then went to Deer Island, and decided that Deer Island was the place that had the right facilities for a hospital.
The short version of this history that I grew up with in Boston was that there was a lot of xenophobia directed against the Irish. But you look at some details here among the local responses. There were people who were very humane, actually.
There were people who were very humane. You don't want to downplay the xenophobia, though. There was a tremendous amount of xenophobia, of resentment against Irish immigrants. There had been for quite a while, but so many were coming in now that it was really beginning to develop into a political crisis. People began to suggest, well, immigrants that have not been bonded, that have not do not have support from the shipmasters as required by law, should be deported. And so that idea really got going during this time. So there was a great deal of resentment against the incoming Irish immigrants for racial, religious, and also economic reasons, because they were seen as taking jobs. But on the other hand, there was among the host community compassion among several people, and several people who were in a position to look after.
People you call the first responders.
The first responders, yes. And this was the city council themselves. I mean, the president of the city council made a speech. A fellow by the name of George Hillard, who was stepping down at the end of June as president of the Common Council. He gave in his farewell speech, he admonished people. We have to be kind to we have to look out for these people. We have to be humanitarian. We it is our moral duty to ensure that they are cared for, that they are fed. And by this time, the City Council had established its hospital on the island. By the end of May, they had renovated some of the structures that were on the island and began to build a whole separate building there. And they appointed, it was interesting because the event took place May 25th. That was the exact day on which the doctor was appointed, May 25th, 1847. And his name was Joseph Moriarty. And he was very, very anxious to become the resident physician out on the island. And he was unanimously selected to head up the facility there.
This is BNN News. We're talking with John McColgan about the Famine Memorial on Deer Island. John, people also have the short version that the Irish came here because the potato crop failed or there was a famine, but get beyond those physical factors. Why did this happen?
Yeah, well, there was certainly a crop crisis there. An unknown fungus had attacked the potato, but the potato was the only food source for millions of people. In previous famines, in the 17th, 18th, early 19th century, the government actually did something about it. They prevented the export of oats and grain, and called for more food to be brought into the country. But in the middle of the 19th century, by the 1840s, this ideology of laissez-faire took over, and there was a belief that, well, you really can't feed people by themselves because they're not working for it, and the problem is that it's the moral character of the people that is preventing them from bettering themselves. So therefore, well, what happened was that they actually, in the middle of the famine, closed their soup kitchens, and took measures that effectively starved the population. They exacerbated the effects of famine. So it said that it was a crop failure, but the British brought the famine on.
You call this, I guess, essentially the plague of colonialism. There's a problem there with the balance of political power. Explain that part a little bit about how that made this all worse. That the Irish didn't have enough power to control things, whether it was the famine relief or even control of the land.
Well, it goes back centuries. Ireland was England's first colony. Ireland was effectively seized by Britain for its own enrichment. The land was seized. Early on, the Gaelic aristocracy was driven out and succeeded by an alien aristocracy, alien in ethnicity, alien in religion. And the country was used for the purposes of enriching that class of people. In 1800, the British Parliament passed the Act of Union. And the Act of Union meant that that Britain and Ireland were to become a single body politic. They were to become the same country. On the other hand, de facto, Ireland remained a colony. The Irish industry had begun to thrive in the late 18th century. In the early 19th century, they did away with the tariffs. So as a result, Irish industry could not protect itself. So Irish industry was decimated, was pretty much devastated outside of the Belfast area. And as a result, the population, the agrarian population, exploded with not that much to do, and farms became economic, uneconomic. The evictions accelerated, and people who had a bit of money and a bit of energy and wanted to do something with their lives couldn't do it in Ireland, so they immigrated.
And of course, this follows the Highland clearances in Scotland. I want to come back to the island. You're out there for the ceremony. You know the story, the people, the unmarked graves. How did it feel to be out there thinking about this?
Well, I always look out over the harbour at Deer Island, and I can't look at Deer Island without thinking back to what happened there in 1847. Because with the records that we have in the city archives, we know something about the topography at that time. We know something about what happened when the hospital was set up and they established a quarantine station at the southern tip of the island. And I always think, too, of the decision that that city council committee made on the day the hospital opened to locate a burial ground on near the northwest side of the most northerly hill on the island. And that's where they began to bury the dead. And that happened for the first time on June 1st, when a little baby, 1-year-old Mary Connell, died of typhus.
Thank you very much for being with us and remembering John McColgan. Up ahead, the Dorchester segment with Jennifer Smith.